David McNally, Professor of Political Science at York University and a member of the New Socialist Group. David, 25 minutes like the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghu. And also thanks to the Socialist Project for organizing this forum, which is, needless to say, incredibly timely and I think for the left really quite a crucial discussion and debate. And I'll begin with something of a confession, which is to tell you that I have been somewhat obsessed over the last year with this crisis. Probably spent more time reading things like the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times than is good for my health. But one of the things I do is I collect some of my favorite front pages and headlines. So I'm going to show you one of my more recent favorites, this actually from the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, Wall Street Rest in Peace. Now, the mere fact that that could appear tells us something, and I want to just emphasize for us where we are. The fact that we have lived through the collapse of all 5 Wall Street investment banks is extraordinary. They have all melted down. They have all collapsed. They've either declared bankruptcy or been taken over. We have seen not only the largest corporate failure ever, which happened first, Lehman Brothers, which was, by the way, 10 times bigger than the collapse of Enron in December of 2001. But followed by the even larger collapse of AIG Insurance. We've also seen the world's largest bank failure, Washington Mutual, that went under just last week. And now, of course, the crisis is extending itself to Europe in a very, very major way, one bank after another in the last 4 or 5 days across the European continent. And part of my argument will be that this is a systemic crisis. That is to say, this crisis is not fundamentally about policies of deregulation associated with neoliberalism, although they play a role. Fundamentally, those processes are driven by larger structural and systemic trends within capitalism in its neoliberal phase. The other one I must share with you is the one, both to begin with because of understatement, that appeared in the Toronto Star last week. A little problem with capitalism. Now, I like it both for understatement, but also for the fact that we get for, I don't know, first time in how long, Karl Marx appearing on the front page of the Toronto Star, who, you know, unfortunately is described as a German philosopher who suffered from boils. I suggest to you there's a bit to be desired in terms of just what Marx might offer us in making sense of the current crisis. But the crisis is extremely serious and is distinguished from a number of the asset bubble crises of the last 10, 15 years, distinguished in 2 key ways. First, in its global scope. That is to say, this is not the collapse of the banking and financial sector in Argentina. This is a globalizing crisis. Secondly, it is a crisis at the heart of global capitalism. That is to say, it's happening at the very center of the system, the American economy, Wall Street, etc. Now, there are 5 key features of this crisis that I want to just briefly describe and summarize, and I won't be able to do justice to them, and in many ways I'll be touching on themes that the 2 previous speakers have already developed. But the 5 key features that I think we need to see as part of an interconnected pattern here, elements of one overall structural process. First, the regime of credit money on a global basis. Greg was describing this. The fact that since 1971, the world economy has operated with a monetary system freed from any tie to commodity value, to commodity wealth. When Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard in 1971 and decommodified money, it made it possible for an enormous buildup in the supplies of world money without the disciplining effects of any kind of tie to a commodity. What that's meant is that today about 70% of all US dollars don't circulate inside the US economy. They circulate outside it. And these, by the way, are crucial to the asset bubbles that form time and time again, whether it's the third world debt crisis of the 1980s, whether it's the East Asian crisis of 1997, whether it's the dot-com bubble, or whether it's the current so-called subprime crisis in the U.S. The development of international credit money regime, by its nature, creates these massive amounts of monetary reserves that float through the world economy, forming asset bubbles everywhere possible. And that's related to the phenomenon, Greg touched on it, of financialization. And here it's really important to recognize that we have seen an amazing structural transformation in the distribution of capitalist wealth during the neoliberal period. If you take, for example, the period from the 1950s through the 1970s, financial assets in the United States represented 600%. They represented 400% of gross domestic product. Last year, they represented 1,000%. So in other words, financial assets have grown massively in proportion to what Jim was describing as the real economy. But what are financial assets? They are paper claims on future wealth. That's vital to understand. This brings me to the concept that Greg already introduced, my third point, fictitious capital, and concept taken directly from Marx. But if you take the first trend, this enormous growth of international credit money. Second trend, financialization. More and more of this money is moving through the financial system. It is not going into productive investment in real capital formation. Building new factories, buildings, offices, mines, and so on. It is moving through financial circuits without moving through the productive sector. As that happens, you get this buildup of fictitious capital. And the concept may sound strange at first, so I'm going to, in a second, give you a really basic illustration. But what we have to understand is that what it's meant is that growing amounts of profits made in the United States have come from financial transactions and financial transactions alone. These days, about 28% of all the profits inside the American economy go to the financial sector. And that is double what it was prior to the neoliberal period. It's a massive increase in the share of, to use Marx's term, surplus value that ends up simply circulating in and through the financial sector. And so, what happens essentially is that all kinds of financial instruments get proliferated and packaged. And it can sound completely overwhelming when you hear about collateralized debt obligations and all this sort of stuff. It's not overwhelming. Jim's point from Galbraith is right. It's fundamentally simple. I'm going to give you a basic illustration of how it works. It is the process, the formation of fictitious capital is the process by which IOUs are packaged as assets and sold. That's exactly what it means. It looks like the following. I need money. I borrow it from Raghu. I give him an IOU. A bunch of you discover that Raghu's got money, and you come and you start borrowing from him as well. And he's now got a whole bunch of IOUs. These are claims on other people's money. And then Raghu talks to Jim. Jim's interested in these IOUs too, and so Raghu starts to package them and sell parts of them. So now Greg hears about it, and Greg starts getting in on it. And all of a sudden you've got an IOU that began with me, and then many of you got in on it, being packaged as things like collateralized debt obligations and sold. But what have you bought? What you've bought is a claim to future wealth. If at any point I, for example, cannot pay, or any of you who got in on the borrowing from Raghu and give him a piece of paper called an IOU scheme, can't pay, the chain breaks. The chain of payment breaks, and what happens is these so-called assets that banks were using and moving back and forth between one financial institution and another, all of a sudden, they're revealed as being worth either much, much less than they were sold as, or potentially worthless. Take the case of Lehman Brothers. Most of its paper assets, most of its fictitious capital, when it was bought up and taken over a few weeks ago, went at 22 cents on the dollar. Okay? So the IOU for $1 was now worth 22 cents. Well, guess what? A lot of people paid more for it. And they took a killing. And that's what happens when an asset bubble bursts. All kinds of fictitious capital, which is nothing more than a claim to future wealth, is revealed as not being worth what it was at all claimed to be. Now, related to this, no, I want to make one more point before I say this. The other thing we need to recognize is that what this means is that the problem is not simply based in the real estate and housing sector in the United States. The problem is as much within the financial system, which is massively indebted, one institution to another, as it is within housing. In fact, financial sector debt has risen more quickly than mortgage debt in the United States since the year 2000. So you've got, in fact, the interplay and the interconnection of two debt crises right now when you watch these institutions fall on Wall Street. On the one hand, a crisis driven by financial sector debt, which literally does, as I say, just mean banks and financial institutions borrowing from one another, and the housing crisis. Now, the housing crisis comes in under my fourth point, which is what I describe as neoliberal wage compression. That is to say, this part of it is driven by the fact that working class incomes under neoliberalism have been stagnant or falling in real terms. And what this has meant is that for huge numbers of working class people, the only way to sustain or improve standards of living has been by entering into the debt market. So it's not just that people whose incomes were precarious were taking out mortgages on houses, although that's true. The estimates now are that close to 15% of all the houses owned in the United States, the mortgages are worth more than the assets, than the houses. Okay? That's huge, 15%. So it is that. But it's also the fact that as people had these appreciating assets called houses, huge numbers of working class people borrowed against these assets. They went to the banks, they said, my house is now worth so much, give me a line of credit. And they kept up their levels of consumption. They kept up their actual living standards through this. So that since about 2000 or 2001, 30% of the growth of working class consumption in the United States has been by borrowing against house values, equity loans against their housing values. So all of this now is coming together, that is to say, this proliferation of international credit money, financialization, the growth of fictitious capitals, this whole superstructure of IOUs, combined with very, very deep structures of working class debt. And then the fifth and final aspect that I want to refer to before coming to talk about some of what I think this adds up to is the interconnection with US deficits and global imbalances. Because, and Greg again touched on this in his introductory remarks, one of the key things we need to recognize is that essentially the whole global economic expansion since the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2001, the whole global economic expansion has fundamentally hinged on huge amounts of global imports into the US. The United States has just sucked up imports from the rest of the world, and how is it paid for them? It's paid for them effectively by printing money. Effectively. More complicated process, but effectively. They've printed dollars and shipped them around the world. They've ended up particularly in China, Japan, and so on. But these huge global balances were never sustainable in my view. In the long run, you cannot have the country whose currency is the official world money running these massive deficits. Sooner or later, one or another thing has to happen. Either the deficits have to be broken, and they have to stop running them. And by the way, what that means is a huge contraction in the global economy. Enormous. Say about 20% of all world imports have been going into the US since about 2000. For China, for everyone, it means an enormous contraction if there is a huge decline in the US trade and current account deficits. So that's one possibility. Massive devaluation of the US dollar. Logical, not going to happen in the middle of this crisis, because in the middle of this crisis with panic and fear, there's a huge rush to anything that looks like it has security, and US Treasury bills and bonds have that appearance. It ultimately has got to mean in some scenario or other, a rebalancing of power within the global economy, both economic and political, and that can only, in my view, mean, it may be a slow process, it may be a faster process, depending on a whole series of conjunctures and developments, but it can only mean a shift of global power away from the US. Doesn't mean the US won't be still dominant. It will be less dominant. And less dominant with less financial capacities, frankly, also means that this poses a huge crisis for the US capacity to dominate the world in imperial terms. It's going to be a real problem for them to continue to carry on with the same level of intervention. I don't mean that it's impossible, but it's going to produce more economic, political contradictions for them to do that. Now, one thing we need to recognize, of course, in all of this is that what I'm describing, these last 2 points, are both the class contradictions embedded in the current moment. That is to say, when I talk about neoliberal wage compression, we're looking at a situation right now where in the starkest terms, the most fundamental contradictions of capitalism are revealed. That is to say, people's need for housing clashing with the system's need, the capitalist system's needs for profit. And fundamentally, you can see that. I mean, most elementary level, even though I'll suggest to you that could have been a different tactic employed, but some of you may have seen yesterday's small little banner headline that Freddie Mac forgave a mortgage yesterday. Why? Because when they moved in to foreclose on a 70-year-old woman, 90-year-old woman, she shot herself. They said, okay, we forgive this mortgage. Now, I would, by the way, suggest to you that she turned the gun in the wrong direction. But the point is that most fundamentally, what it underlines is literally the class contradictions that are embedded in the moment. The way in which this crisis is being lived by working class people, particularly African Americans and Latinos in the United States, who were the last brought into the housing boom and bubble, is devastating. But also, as I say, it has enormous implications for the structure of global power and imperial power. And I think we're in a period where all of that becomes much more volatile than it has been in the past. So let me wind up by talking about a few of the implications overall of this, if any of the analysis which I'm presenting is correct. Obviously, first and foremost, this is a terrible blow to neoliberal ideology. There's no question. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you had so many of the right wing of the Republican Party voting against the bailout package and ranting and raving about financial socialism and that sort of thing. This is massive state intervention on such an enormous scale, the nationalization of huge chunks of the financial sector by the U.S. state. And by the way, the nationalization can be jigged in all kinds of ways, but fundamentally, that's what it is. It's a huge blow to free market ideology. Secondly, as I'm suggesting to you, I think it is a substantial blow to U.S. leadership, both ideologically, but I think also it's going to impose increasing constraints on the exercise of imperial power. I think as well that is going to produce ever more pressure on a dollar-based global money regime. What exactly that will mean is hard to say. Clearly, the euro has emerged as a partial challenger, but frankly, an enormous amount right now rests upon what China in particular and East Asia in general may or may well not do. I would also suggest to you that this crisis is not going to be over quickly, and that it is going to define the terrain of much political struggle for many years in front of us, and therefore it raises a really important challenges for the left. And of course, if there is an attempt to address the global imbalances, as I said, then a global recession of really severe depth becomes a genuine possibility. Now, it would be wonderful to say that we on the left are well positioned to intervene and affect the kind of political mobilizations and debates that will follow. That's not the case. Nevertheless, every opening that is available ought to be exploited to whatever extent possible. And particularly when you have a situation which so blatantly reveals the way in which capitalism privatizes profits and socializes losses. When it is so blatant, it opens up serious space to contest not only neoliberalism, but all of the dominant ideas of bourgeois ideology. And I think it's going to be important for the left to think beyond Keynesian reforms, to think beyond re-regulating the financial sector, and to begin to raise the fundamental questions, as popularly as we can, of the socialist critique of capitalism in an ongoing and thoroughgoing popular way. And that means, obviously, returning to the German philosopher who suffered from boils and popularizing all of the key elements of Marxist analysis of capitalism and its political economy, but also, of course, popularizing essential ideas of socialism. Production for need, not profit, democratic control, sustainability, and so on. And then, of course, there are going to be very practical tasks, the building of struggles to defend working class people against the worst ravages of the crisis. But I think it's going to be important that we not merely set our sights on the defensive struggles, as important as they are, but that we also try to find every possible way in this crisis to raise up the socialist alternative, to popularize it, to put it forward, because frankly, we haven't seen a crisis for the dominant set of ideas as severe in quite some time, and I think that's a challenge that we need to rise to. Thank you.